Sure. I'd say the biggest difference between, Black Lives in 1980, where I took my deep dive to Black Lives Matter in 2020, is who's speaking for the community. If you look at 1918, and I really looked at 1980, in the wake of the McDuffie killing, the McDuffie investigation, the trial, and the riots, all the voices that are interpreting this for the community are 98% white. Talk about, I guess now we call it white splaining. Now you flash forward to 2020, I would say it was probably 98% black, right? So that's a huge change in just perspective and understanding and the ability to try and explain your own story. And I think, what you also saw down here was an incredible shift on the needle between those who had previously never believed in the idea of systemic racism and those who are now like, well, actually, with issues like redlining, there's a point here. And one thing that happened again and again when I was interviewing Black Miamians for the book was, would talk about what it was like to grow up in Miami here. And again, some of the stories that stand out to me. So Lonnie Lawrence, who was a police commander for the county in 1980 and actually a good friend of Arthur McDuffie, was in this extraordinary position where his friend has been murdered by cops, but he's now got to go out and stand in front of the press and take the side of those cops. So he's in this extraordinary position. But he was telling me about what it would be like when he would go in August to help at his segregated high school to unload the new books for that semester. And, they'd rip them open so excited. Here we have our new books. And guess what? They weren't new books. They were the books that were 2 or 3 years old in tatters that had been passed over from the local white high schools. And guess what? All the kids from the white high schools knew exactly where those books were going. So they all had messages written on the insides. So he's like, that's the Miami I grew up in. And, when you know all of that stuff and, 100 little similar stories, then things like the Miami riots don't seem so much as events as they do inevitabilities. And I think also in 1979, before McDuffie riots, you had this incredible escalation of injustice within the Black community. McDuffie was the straw that breaks the camel's back that leads to the riots. But there are, I think, 5 other huge moments under Janet Reno's tenure in 1980, where there was, for instance, a man who's paused to get out of his car and pee against a building, who was shot in the back of the head by a security guard. Was never even told stop it, just shot through the back of the head. There was a young Black girl, 12 years old, who was molested by a white police officer. There was a wrong house raid where a Black school teacher had his skull fractured. These things were going on all year long. So when McDuffie happens, it seems like an open shut case, right? You've got a Black middle-class insurance executive who's beaten to death by 15 white officers. No one's disputing those facts. So surely in a trial, there'll be at least some form of justice, and there isn't. And I think that sense of injustice lasted a really long time in the Black community, with McDuffie being the obvious standout moment. But, we were the leader of in one big segment in the 1980s. We had more race riots than any other city in America. People say it's 3, it's actually 4, because there was a small one in 1990 as well. And I think in many ways, we did respond as a city to those riots. There is a reflection within the police force where it really does mirror the demographics of the city. All of that were lessons learned. I think there's a reason why we weren't on fire in 2020, is because I think there's still a lot of historic recognition here that we've been there a lot. So maybe we're a bit more patient than most American cities. We have had some progress. It's also blatantly obvious in the city that the areas where we haven't had progress are the very areas that rioted 40 years ago. So we're not out of the woods by any way or means. And voices like Dr. Marvin Dunn, who's a great Black historian in South Florida, are vital to keep these stories alive. If you don't learn them, then you don't know. And if you don't have context, then how can you reach a correct decision?